welcome everybody, and good morning if you're joining us from the US. Good evening if you're joining us from China or Asia, and I guess good day if you're joining us from Europe or elsewhere. Um, let's get started. My name is Devin Lau. I am the Associate Director for Yale Center Beijing, and I will be hosting today's talk, which I'm sure you guys are well aware will be a few reflections on the 2024 elections in the US. Um, and I see that many of you have already started turning on your webcams. For those of you that are able to turn on your webcams, it would be great if you could, just so we can see some faces. Let me introduce the speaker and we'll go straight into our topic today. So Professor Alan Gerber is Sterling Professor of Political Science, as well as Economics and Statistics and Data Science at Yale. And for those of you that don't know, Sterling Professor is the highest uh, named professorship at Yale. So happy to have Alan join us here. He's also the director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and his current research focuses on the political economy of evidence production and use in public policy and organizations. He's published extensively on the application of experimental methods to the study of campaign communications, and he's also designed and performed experimental evaluations of many different political communications programs, both partisan and nonpartisan in nature. His book, of course, on field experiments that he co-authored with Donald Green is a widely used resource for researchers seeking to apply field experimental methods to problems in the social sciences. And he's published so many books and articles that I won't even go through the trouble of naming all of them. He's also a graduate of Yale as an undergrad and received his PhD from MIT. And he's extremely qualified to speak about our topic today. And so I'm happy to turn things over to him now.
Hey, Devin, thank you very much, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to be going through some slides to sort of provide you a bit of a background and some of my reflections on the election, identify some issues that we might want to talk about in our question and answer period, and give you a sense of how social scientists analyze elections. I'm not always sure what topics are of greatest interest to different audiences, but I'll try to only spend maybe 20 to 25 minutes on my remarks so that there's plenty of time left for me to try and answer questions that you might have. So let me just get started now. I'm gonna talk about four things. I'm gonna focus on these four things. How the economic context for the 2024 election, how the Biden administration, how the economy performed during the Biden administration does a good job of explaining what happened in the American election. It's also the case that a similar pattern held in throughout the Western democracies over the last year or two. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about other factors in addition to the economy, the candidate quality and the election outcome. So candidate quality just refers to things like people's assessments of the candidates' likability, personal characteristics, qualifications for office, and then the issues. So in addition to just being a retrospective evaluation of the economy and deciding whether or not the incumbent administration deserved another term in office, there were issues. I'm going to briefly discuss some of the issues that voters were focused on in 2024. And then I'm going to spend a few minutes just reviewing a little bit of data on public opinion toward China and talk a little bit about the implications of the 2024 election results given patterns in public opinion. And I will warn everyone in advance that I looked up some stuff about China and public opinion. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I really I do the things that Devin described. I design experimental studies and do more statistical analysis of political science things. And I'm mostly focused on American domestic stuff. Okay, so on the subject of the economy and the presidential election, here's the, if you had to look at just one chart to try and figure out what would happen in a presidential election, this is probably the chart you would want to start with. And so let me just describe what's on this chart. The y-axis is incumbent presidential vote share. So in the 2024 election, this would be the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party was in power during the previous 4 years. American presidential elections are a fixed term of 4 years. So you've got 4 years of Democrats or 4 years of Republicans, and this is their vote share. And the x-axis is how the economy is growing. So one measure of growth is annualized real per capita growth in the election year. And in a typical year, that would be something around, in America, not in China. In China, it would be faster in the last few decades. It might be out here, or maybe here now. But in the United States, it's around here. It's around 2 percentage points, something like that. And so, if you have a typical year of economic growth when the election is being held, then what you would find is that you would typically see that the incumbent party would get a little bit over 50%, so somewhere between 50 and 55%, which is enough to win. So as you would guess from this chart, most of the time a presidential incumbent party running for reelection, if the incumbent is running for reelection, they tend to win 2 times out of 3. Okay, and that's about half the time an incumbent is running for reelection. So you're seeing elections sort of in here. In 2020, it was a bad year of economic growth. That was the year of the global pandemic. Economic growth was very low. Here is what Donald Trump got of the two-party vote in 2020. That wasn't enough. That wasn't enough to win. It was 48% or so of the vote. That was not enough to win. And you can see that the relationship is very tight as these sort of things go for a single variable. So this is a very strong regularity. It's also the case that inflation over the term in office is negatively correlated with vote share. The best predictor is the aggregate inflation experience. So prices go up a lot during your term. That's a very large drag on your vote share. The United States has not experienced inflation like it experienced over the last 4 years, since in the last 2+ decades. So most of the people who are around and voting, they don't remember a period, or the older people maybe, but the younger people don't remember a period of inflation like we experienced in the United States over the last 4 years. So it's a little bit of a question as to how they're going to respond to that, but based on the statistics of how people have responded in the past, you would expect this to be a very big problem for the incumbent party. And so what was the economic context for the election in November of 2024? High inflation over the previous 4 years, moderate economic growth in the inflation year. And so what does that mean for how the incumbent party, the Democrats, are likely to do in November? So we can say that this does not look like a great record. It looks okay, but not great. We can do a lot better, be much more precise in our predictions using the data on presidential elections and conducting some statistical analysis. And this is the sort of thing that economists and political scientists do. They construct statistical models to assess how different economic and political factors affect vote shares. And so here's an example of such a model. I'm not going to go into the details of all of how this is done, but it's basically a simple it's a simple regression analysis of Democratic vote share. So this is the Democratic share of the two-party vote on a number of political variables, and then economic growth in the election year, inflation over the course of the term, and then some measure of quarters where economic growth was exceptionally strong. And then you perform this statistical analysis on the previous 100 years of presidential elections, and then you get a model, and then you can use that model to predict how, under the current elections conditions, you would expect the Democratic Party to do. And so, so let's take a look at what this means when we apply it to the election in 2024. Okay, here we are. So in the current election, we would put in the numbers for this year's growth, and that's 1.97%. That's per capita annualized GDP growth. You would put in this year's inflation, actually the experience of the last 4 years average inflation, and that was 4.54%. That is much higher than the typical experience, which I think this is over the last 50 years of presidential elections, that averaged 2.7%. And if you put all those numbers in and just sort of add it all up, 47.4 plus 0.71 times the growth rate minus 0.61 times the inflation rate plus 0.87 times the number of good quarters, you would end up with a predicted Democratic vote share of 49.5% of the two-party vote, and the actual election outcome was 49%. So this is I mean, statistics don't usually work this well, and this model doesn't usually predict this well. But what we saw in 2024 was pretty much exactly what you would expect if you just looked at the economic context. So, typically this model misses by a few percentage points, and it misses because there are other things that determine election outcomes, not just the economic context, though I think the economic context is extremely powerful factor. And there's sometimes the parties have differential issue appeal, like sometimes one party is better aligned than the other party with public opinion. Sometimes you have a very bad candidate, or very, not bad necessarily, but an unpopular candidate. Sometimes one party runs a better campaign. So those are other factors that might that might lead to differences in how the election turns out. It's also the case that, it's a simple model, and so there may be reasons why in any given election the incumbent party is held more or less responsible for the economic performance, and that's something that's not captured in the model. That's not another variable in the model. One might wonder, what if it were the case that economic conditions were a little different? So, for example, maybe the economic conditions were more typical. What if it were the case that Joe Biden, who was the president, was able to continue on and did not decide that he would step aside due to all the concerns that people had, and I guess that he might have had also, that he was able to run a vigorous reelection campaign. Well, when an incumbent runs for reelection, that is associated with a boost in the president's party's vote share. And so if we had a Joe Biden running for reelection. And again, as a typical incumbent might, that means a vigorous person who feels capable of taking on the office for another 4 years. If those things had been in place, then if we had had a normal economy, say, not the big inflation and an incumbent president running for reelection, which is typically the case after a first term in power, then the Democrats would probably have won. Okay, so that would have been enough. That's the kind of thing, because America typically reelects its incumbents, and that would have been enough. So the economy wasn't was the economy caused a somewhat of a drag, a 1.3% drag on the vote share, and the fact that you didn't have an incumbent running for reelection, that also caused a drag, enough to cause the election to go to the Republicans probably. One other factor about these models is you can use them to sort of benchmark candidates and campaigns. And one thing, if you went back and looked at 2016 and 2020, the actual Democratic vote was greater than the predicted vote. And in those elections, the Republican candidate for president was Donald Trump. And one possible explanation for the performance of the Democrats in 2016 and 2020, which again exceeded what you would have expected given economic fundamentals, is that they were facing a candidate who was not a good candidate. And again, that people, just all things equal, were not super excited about Donald Trump per se. They voted Republican for all sorts of reasons, but not because necessarily because of what the candidate's personal qualities were contributing. And let me just sort of discuss that now in a little bit more detail. Candidate quality. So the first thing I discussed was the economic context, and the economic context was, I would say, somewhat favorable to the Republicans. So that's sort of your starting point. But what about the candidates? Maybe if one party had an exceptionally popular and exciting candidate, that might overcome that natural disadvantage. Was that the case? Was there a real differential between the candidates and their popularity? And or more generally, if you were to think about the election, would you say that the Republicans won because Trump is just a very, very popular person, and it's very hard to overcome Trump's appeal? The answer is that that's not the case. So again, there are some people who are extremely excited about Donald Trump, absolutely. But if you think about the broad public, Donald Trump is generally not an especially popular person as candidate, and his performance as president while he was in office, was not unusually highly rated. In fact, if you take a look, this is just an example of this, putting Donald Trump in historical context. His presidential approval ratings were the lowest of any post-war U.S. president. If you think about his personal favorability and Harris's personal favorability, one of the striking features of the candidates over the last few elections is that they tend to do poorly on favorability ratings. So this is you get asked a question by a polling agency, something like, as I read each name, please say if you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of these people. So if you look at Trump and Harris, Trump was net -8. So this means those people who said they had a somewhat or very unfavorable opinion exceeded the number who said that they have a very or somewhat favorable opinion by 8 percentage points. And here's Harris coming in there at -2. So -2 is also a bad number. Okay. So what we had in 2024 was, again, I'm not giving any value judgment personally. I'm just sort of saying how the public was evaluating these candidates according to favorability or unfavorability. According to these statistics, Trump was net net unfavorable 8 percentage points, but Harris was also net unfavorable by 2 percentage points. And if you were to compare this to, again, if we had more time, I'd go through the historical numbers. You looked historically, these are low favorability ratings. So if you were to put Trump and Harris into historical context, until the last few elections, you did not see people with negative numbers. And if you look historically, since the over the last 50 years, the candidates with negative numbers were George Wallace, who was a failed third party candidate, Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican candidate for president in 1964 and lost in a landslide, uh, Senator McGovern, George McGovern, again, negative or close to negative. He was about even, and that was enough for him to lose the 1972 election by a landslide, and then John Kerry, who lost to George Bush. So these are negative candidate assessments. Maybe Trump, in terms of favorability, a little more negative than Harris, which might have been enough to offset somewhat the economic advantage that Donald Trump would have experienced, but it wasn't enough. But it was definitely, I think, a little bit of a headwind for Donald Trump that his personal favorability ratings were not actually very very high. And he was fortunate that he faced a candidate who had low favorability ratings by the time the election rolled around as well. Okay, and then I just want to briefly touch on a few of the issues. We can talk more about this in questions if there are questions about this. But this is just an example. There's a number of different ways that people look at this. But one way is by looking at, what are the voting issues that people are going to find extremely important as they think about the presidential vote. And here you have. I decided to break this down by party, or look at a breakdown by party. The overall, if you looked at what issues people thought were very important, the issues were the economy, immigration, democracy in the United States, and abortion. If you were to look across the entire population, voting population, here, if you look at the parties, there's some difference across parties that I thought was interesting. The Republican voters were focused on the economy, which they generally thought was poor, and immigration, which they generally thought was not being handled well by the federal government. And then the Democratic voters were concerned about democracy in the United States, and this was concern about Donald Trump and his the idea that he might be a threat to democracy based on his record and his statements. And then the Supreme Court and abortion. So reproductive rights became a very big issue in the United States, even bigger than it had been before, due to a Supreme Court decision. This is the big federal court that is the final word on the interpretation of the Constitution. They determined that there was not a constitutional protection for the right to have an abortion, and so that became a state policy matter, and that opened up all sorts of possibilities for restrictions of access to abortion and other reproductive health services, and that was a very important issue for many Americans, and it was especially important, as we can see here, to the Democrat and Democratic-leaning independent voters. And there's a lot to talk about in terms of issues and issue positions of the parties. I'm going to leave that to questions if we have some questions. And then finally, I wanted just to touch on the issue of China, public opinion, and the election. And so here I just wanted to start with favorability ratings. This isn't about candidates. This is favorability ratings of countries. And so this is asking not, do you have a favorable opinion of Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, but what's your opinion of a country? And I we can go into this again and also in a little more detail. I don't think the typical American has a deep knowledge of a lot of these countries. Some of these countries, I don't think, but so you have to take these answers for what they are. But this is just an example of a kind of a relatively recent take on this. It hasn't changed all that much in the last year. But if you take a look, countries that are viewed as very or mostly favorable, you can see those are the sort of Anglosphere kind of countries, the Canada and Britain, and then Europe and Japan. And then if you sort of go down, if you go down the list, you see this cluster at the bottom here. And what have you got? You've got like North Korea, Russia, Iran, China. So it's pretty low down in terms of favorability ratings. And this is, you're really just asking literally a random person in the American population, what do you think about these countries? And they're kind of giving you whatever they have to say on this. But this is what they have to say. And then couple other slides, and then we'll open it up to questions. This is not a perennial thing. This isn't like every time we've done this survey in the past, or at Pew or Gallup or whoever has done this survey. It's always the case that China is viewed very unfavorably. In fact, it really is a relatively recent phenomenon. You can see there it's over the last 7 or 8 years that this has sort of occurred. And I'd be interested in hearing people's views about why that might be. I don't. Again, I'm not an expert on public opinion toward other countries, but I have a little bit of background knowledge of that. But I'd be very interested in hearing other people's views. And then finally, here's the breakdown by party. So a majority of conservative Republicans hold very unfavorable views of China. So this is, if you looked at if you broke down that favorable, unfavorable chart by party overall, and this would be both favorable, both very and somewhat unfavorable. It would be Republicans 90 to 9, very or somewhat unfavorable to very or somewhat favorable, and Democrats are still pretty heavily unfavorable, but it's a 77 to 21. So it's noticeably less unfavorable, but still rather unfavorable. And if you sort of look at just very unfavorable, there is a clear difference across the parties. Conservative Republicans are, really extremely negative in terms of, this is again, this isn't politicians, this is the general public. Conservative Republicans are extremely negative, 68% with a very unfavorable opinion of China. There's a question that asks, is China an enemy, a competitor, or an ally or friend or something like that? And when given that choice, I believe that's what this question is about. 69% of the conservative Republicans are, you can see for yourself, quite negative. And then, this some index of concern about China as a competitor is indicated by the third column. So let me stop there.